History is not just written by the victors. It is built by the forgotten. It's forged in the fires of sprawling factories, in the minds of engineers who are told no, and in the husks of ideas declared obsolete. We often speak of the great battles, the brilliant generals, and the tanks that rolled across continents. But what about the secrets? What about the weapons that almost never existed? The Second World War was a symphony of innovation, but for every new fighter plane that took to the skies, there was a blueprint that was burned. For every new rifle in a soldier's hands, there was a prototype tossed onto a scrap heap. This is the story of one such idea, a piece of machinery so radical, so unorthodox, that it was deemed a failure, a waste of precious resources, and left to rust in the corner of a drafty warehouse. It was an engine without a purpose, an orphan of the industrial war machine. But in the darkest hour of the conflict, when a top-secret Allied project faced catastrophic failure, a project that could shorten the war and save countless lives, a desperate call was made. They needed a miracle. What they found was a scrapped engine. Before we dive into this incredible piece of hidden history, help our channel grow and bring more of these stories to light. Take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. And for our question of the day, we know our community is global. Let us know in the comments what country and city you are watching from. We love to see how far these stories travel. The air in the cavernous assembly hall of the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Detroit was thick with the metallic tang of ozone and the bitter cold bite of the 1943 Michigan winter. Outside, snow blanketed the world in a deceptive peace. Inside, there was only the frantic, thunderous rhythm of war. Thousands of men and women, shadows in the glare of welding arcs, moved with a desperate urgency. They were not just building tanks. They were building an avalanche of steel intended to crush the Third Reich. Yet, in a cordoned-off section of the proving grounds, designated Project Liar, there was no thunder. There was only silence, failure, and the icy stare of military procurement officers. Project Liar was the Allies' best-kept secret and its biggest headache. It wasn't a tank, at least not in the conventional sense. It was a mobile acoustic decoy generator, or MAD-G. The concept was audacious, bordering on science fiction. The MAD-G was designed to be deployed deep behind enemy lines, a lone vehicle that could, through a complex system of massive speakers, amplifiers, and pre-recorded audio, perfectly mimic the sound of an entire armored division on the move. It was a phantom army. It could draw enemy panzer divisions away from a real objective, tricking them into defending an empty stretch of French countryside while the real invasion force landed elsewhere. It was deception on an industrial scale, the brainchild of a team of acoustics engineers from Bell Labs and theater sound designers from Hollywood. The problem was power. The vehicle itself was a modified M4 Sherman chassis, but the turret was a 3-ton bank of vacuum tubes, transformers, and massive loudspeaker horns. To generate the bone-rattling, ground-shaking sound of 500 tanks, the MAD-G needed an astronomical, constant, and incredibly clean electrical current. The standard Sherman engine, the 400-horsepower Wright Continental R975, was a brilliant aviation-derived radial engine for moving a tank, but it was a disaster for this. It was designed for propulsion, not for being a stable mobile power station. When the engineers tried to hook up the massive electrical generator required, the engine's power output was erratic. It created electrical noise that sent horrific feedback squeals through the audio system, and when run at the required load for more than 10 minutes, it simply overheated and seized. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thorne, the man in charge of the project, stood with his arms crossed, his breath fogging in the cold air of the test bay. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you have burned out 3 engines this week. The planners in London are finalizing the maps for Overlord. They have based their entire diversionary strategy, Operation Fortitude, on the assumption that I can deliver 12 of these ghost machines. At present, I cannot even deliver 1. The project's chief engineer, a harried-looking man named Frank Belden, wiped his hands on an oily rag. "Sir, the R975 can't do it. The power takeoff isn't rated for this kind of load. The harmonics are shaking the engine apart. We need a different prime mover. We've requisitioned a Ford GAF. We've even looked at the diesel. It's not good enough, Frank. Thorne cut him off. The Ford is too heavy. It guts the vehicle's mobility. The GM diesel is too loud. It interferes with the acoustic output. We are stuck. The project is failing. Thorne kicked at a frozen clump of mud on the concrete floor. I'm giving you 72 hours. Find me an engine. If you can't, I'm pulling the plug on Liar. I'll report to Eisenhower that the Phantom Army is dead. He turned and walked away, the sound of his boots echoing in the oppressive silence. The engineers stood there, defeated. They had tried everything. The arsenal was filled with the best engines America could produce, and none of them worked. As the other men began to disperse, muttering curses and talking of packing their bags, one man remained. His name was Thomas "Tommy" Vallis, and he wasn't really an engineer. He was a mechanic, a grease monkey who had been brought in from a small experimental automotive firm in Ohio that had gone bankrupt a year prior. His job at the arsenal was low level. He calibrated fuel injection pumps. He was quiet, unassuming, and had a slight limp from a childhood bout with polio. He was overlooked by everyone, which is precisely why he had been able to get away with his little secret. Tommy walked slowly, not toward the mess hall, but toward the back of the arsenal, to Warehouse 9. This was the graveyard. Warehouse 9 was where rejected prototypes, failed components, and scrapped tooling were left to be cannibalized for parts or eventually melted down. He pulled a key from his pocket and undid the heavy padlock on a chain-link cage in the darkest corner of the building. He slipped inside and pulled a heavy, oil-stained canvas tarp off a strange, hulking shape. It was an engine, but it was unlike anything on the factory floor. It was compact, a V12, but its most striking feature was the complex, almost organic-looking array of pipes and high-voltage conduits covering its surface. This was the Vallis Grise H12, or as the bankruptcy lawyers had called it, the Anchor. It was Tommy's life's work. Before the war, his small company had been trying to build a revolutionary new power plant for luxury automobiles. It was a diesel-electric hybrid. The concept was simple, but the execution was maddeningly complex. A small, highly efficient diesel engine ran at a single, perfect, constant speed, its sweet spot. It wasn't connected to the wheels. Instead, it was connected directly to a high-output generator. This generator then fed clean, stable, massive amounts of electrical current to two powerful electric motors that actually drove the vehicle. In 1940, the idea was laughable. It was incredibly heavy, ridiculously expensive, and the military testers who had looked at it rejected it immediately. Too complex, the report said. No battlefield application. Too many points of failure. The design is to be scrapped. When Tommy's company went under, the assets were seized by the government, and the single working prototype of the H12 was shipped to the Chrysler arsenal, labeled for scrap and forgotten. But Tommy Vallis had not forgotten. For 6 months, he had secretly spent his nights here in the cold, dark warehouse, tinkering with it. He'd scavenged parts, bypassed the procurement forms, and kept it maintained. He loved it. It was his masterpiece, a failure he couldn't let go of. He ran a hand over the cold metal. The general needed an engine that could produce a massive, constant, clean electrical current. He didn't need a tank engine. He needed a mobile power station. The H12 wasn't designed to be a tank engine. It was designed to be exactly that. The diesel component was small and incredibly quiet, designed for a luxury car. The generator could produce a steady 300 kilowatts without even straining. It was perfect. Tommy looked at his creation, the thing that had ruined his career and cost him his company. It was a joke, a white elephant, a pile of junk. And it was, he realized with a sudden, heart-pounding jolt, the only thing that could save Project Liar. He stepped back, his mind racing. How could he, a low-level mechanic, convince a lieutenant colonel and a team of high-level engineers to risk the entire project on an engine that had already been officially designated as scrap? It was impossible. They would laugh him out of the room, or worse, have him court-martialed for wasting time. He looked at the engine, then at the door. He was terrified. But then he thought about the failure in the test bay, about the general's ultimatum, and about the Phantom Army that needed a heart. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and grabbed a set of wrenches. If they wouldn't listen to him, he would have to show them. He would have to bring the dead back to life. He wasn't just going to suggest his engine. He was going to install it. He had 72 hours. The race against time had begun. He clicked on his small work lamp, and in the dark corner of the forgotten warehouse, a spark of ignition caught. The scrapped engine was about to get its second chance. The next 48 hours were a blur of calculated theft, adrenaline, and freezing cold steel. Tommy Vallis operated in the shadows of the arsenal, a ghost in his own machine. He was not just a mechanic. He had become a saboteur for his own side. He knew he had to get the H-12 from Warehouse 9 to the Project Liar test bay, a distance of half a mile, without a single person from procurement or the military police catching him. He started with the engine itself. The H-12, with its attached generator, weighed over 3 tons. It was bolted to a steel shipping cradle. He couldn't use a standard Arsenal forklift. The requisition forms were a nightmare, and the yellow-painted machines were too loud, too visible. He waited until the 2 and 0 a.m. shift change, when the graveyard crew was bleary-eyed and huddled around the coffee urns in the mess hall. He borrowed a chain hoist from the main tank assembly line and a set of heavy-duty rollers from the transmission depot. Working alone in the freezing dark, his breath pluming, he used the hoist to lift the engine just enough to slide the rollers underneath the cradle. The screech of the metal chain was a gunshot in the silence, and he froze, his heart hammering against his ribs, listening. Nothing. Only the distant groan of the factory. He then used a heavy-duty tow strap, also requisitioned, and a small electric M5 Clitrack tug, the kind used for moving shell casings and parts bins, quiet as a whisper, to slowly, agonizingly, drag his engine out of the cage and toward the massive bay door of Warehouse 9. Every few feet, a roller would slip on the uneven concrete, and he'd have to stop, his muscles screaming, to kick it back into place with his boot. The limp he'd had since childhood ached, a sharp, cold throb that ran from his ankle to his hip. By dawn, he had the engine just inside the door of the Project Liar bay. The main test area was empty, the engineers and officers not due for hours. He saw the failed prototype, MAD G01, sitting there under the harsh work lights, a monument to their frustration. Its engine bay was open, the failed R975 radial engine having been ripped out and discarded in a corner like a dead animal. Tommy felt a surge of panic. This was the point of no return. The moment he touched the prototype, he was moving from unauthorized borrowing to outright sabotage and insubordination. He thought of the court-martial. He thought of the disgrace. Then he thought of the engine he had built, the beautiful, constant hum it should be making. He put the tug in gear and dragged the H-12 into the light. The first major problem was space. The H-12 was a V-12, long and narrow, while the R975 it was replacing was a radial, short and fat like a drum. The M4 chassis was designed for the radial. The engine mounts didn't line up. The transmission housing was in the wrong place. The cooling system was incompatible. A real engineering team would have taken 6 months to draft blueprints, retool the chassis, and cast new parts. Tommy had just over a day. He didn't have blueprints. He had a cutting torch and a welder. For the next 12 hours, he became a butcher. He took the oxyacetylene torch and cut out the original engine mounts, the white-hot slag and angry orange in the dim light. He cut into the firewall, needing an extra 6 inches of clearance for the generator's housing. The sound of the torch was deafening, a screaming hiss that he prayed would be covered by the din of the main factory floor. He had to fabricate new engine mounts from scrap steel he'd pulled from a dumpster. He laid beads with the arc welder, his hands steady, the brilliant blue-white light of the arc illuminating his face, hidden behind a heavy mask. He was exhausted, his stomach empty, but he was alive. This was what he was born to do. This was not calibration. This was creation. As the sun began to set on the second day, Frank Belden, the chief engineer, walked into the bay. He was carrying a briefcase, his face etched with the grim lines of a man who had already accepted defeat and was just there to clear out his desk. He stopped dead. He saw the sparks. He saw the M4 chassis, his multi-million-dollar nightmare, being actively butchered by the low-level fuel pump mechanic. "Valas!" Belden roared, his voice echoing off the steel. "What in the hell do you think you're doing? I'm calling the MPs. You're destroying government property." Tommy didn't even turn around. He just shut off the torch, the sudden silence deafening. He lifted his mask, his face covered in soot, his eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot. "It won't work," Tommy said, his voice a hoarse croak. "What won't work?" Belden snapped, stalking closer. "The cooling," Tommy said, tapping a large pipe on the M4. "The original radiator for the radial engine. It's designed for airflow from a propeller. It's inefficient. My engine runs hotter. I need a bigger radiator, and I need to reroute the entire system. But the hoses I need, they're designated for the M26 Pershing prototypes. They're under lock and key." Belden was speechless. He stared at the engine Tommy had somehow shoehorned into the chassis. He didn't recognize it. It looked impossible. "What is that?" "It's the H-12, Tommy said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "She's a diesel-electric, runs at a constant 400 RPM. The generator is rated for 300 kilowatts, clean output, no harmonic distortion. It's exactly what you need, but it will melt itself into a puddle of slag if I can't cool it." Belden, a man who had studied at MIT, who understood the highest levels of engineering theory, walked slowly around the engine. He looked at the hybrid generator. He looked at the complex fuel system. He looked at the electric motors Tommy had already coupled to the tank's final drive. He had done the work of a 20-man team in 2 days. It was crude, the welds were ugly, but the logic was sound. A constant-speed diesel generator. Why hadn't they thought of that? It was the perfect solution. "You're the fuel pump guy," Belden said, more to himself than to Tommy. "Yes, sir," Tommy said, finally turning to face him. "And I'm also the guy who designed that engine. It was my company before the war." The admission hung in the air. Belden stared at Tommy, seeing him for the first time. The quiet mechanic was gone. In his place was a desperate, brilliant, and slightly unhinged engineer. Belden looked at the H-12, then at the discarded R975. He was supposed to be reporting to Colonel Thorne that Project Liar was a failure. "The M26 hoses," Belden said, his voice changing, the authority returning. "How many?" "4, Tommy said, his heart suddenly leaping. 2-inch diameter, reinforced. And the radiator? The spare cooling unit from the diesel-electric switcher locomotive they use in the rail yard. It's big, but it will fit if I mount it externally, on the rear plate." Belden nodded slowly. "An external, unarmored radiator, 1 piece of shrapnel, and the whole thing is useless." "It's a decoy, sir," Tommy said. "It's not supposed to get into a fight. It's supposed to sound like a fight. If it gets shot at, it's already failed." A slow smile spread across Belden's exhausted face. "You've been thinking about this, haven't you, Valas?" He looked at his watch. "Colonel Thorne arrives for the final sign-off, and my execution, in 16 hours. You and I, we are going to need those hoses, and that locomotive radiator." Beloit turned and strode to the secure phone on the wall. He dialed a number. "This is Belden, Project Liar. I need the night shift heavy lift team at the rail yard, now, and I need someone from Ordnance to open the M26 parts cage. Yes, now. My authorization." He hung up and looked at Tommy. "Go wash your face, Valas. You look like hell. Then you and I are going to plumb the quietest, most powerful diesel-electric hybrid in the world into a goddamn Sherman tank, and if it works, I'll be the one to explain this mess to the Colonel, if it doesn't." Belden patted the hull of the Mad EG. "You and I will be shipping out to the Aleutian Islands by the end of the week. Now move." For the first time in 2 days, Tommy Valas smiled. He wasn't alone anymore. He grabbed a clean rag and wiped the grease from his hands. The team had been reduced to 2, but the impossible task suddenly felt merely difficult. The race was on. The scrapped engine was about to get its first taste of real power. The 16 hours that followed were not engineering. They were a controlled detonation. The arrival of Frank Belden's authorization was like a dam breaking. Suddenly, the lonely clandestine project in the test bay became the Arsenal's singular. frantic focus. The heavy lift team, baffled and grumbling, arrived from the rail yard, their massive gantry crane normally used for lifting locomotive engines. They stared in disbelief as Belden and Tommy directed them to unbolt and gently lift the 500-pound radiator assembly from the yard's switcher engine. It was a beast of copper and steel, 5 feet tall and 8 feet wide, designed to cool a 600-horsepower diesel prime mover, not a tank. "Where the hell do you want this, Mr. Belden?" the foreman yelled over the diesel idling on the crane truck. "On the back of that Sherman," Belden yelled back, pointing. The men looked at him like he was insane, but the authorization papers were signed, and in a wartime army, you don't question a signed order. With agonizing slowness, they maneuvered the massive radiator into place, holding it against the rear armored plate of the M4 chassis. Tommy and Belden were there, welding and bolting, fabricating a heavy-duty steel frame, an exoskeleton, Belden called it, to hold the monstrous cooler in place. It was ugly. It was exposed. It completely ruined the tank's silhouette and would make it a target for a blind machine gunner, but it had the surface area to dissipate the heat from the H-12, and that's all that mattered. Next came the hoses. The M26 Pershing parts cage was opened, and the precious, reinforced 2-inch diameter hoses were handed over. They were stiff and unwieldy, designed for a next-generation heavy tank, not this bastardized hybrid. Tommy, his arms aching, his knuckles already bloody, fought them into place. He routed them through the holes he'd torched in the firewall, connecting the engine's water pump to the new, external radiator. He had to triple clamp every fitting, his hands cramping from the force needed to tighten the steel bands. One leak, one burst hose under pressure, and the H-12 would cook itself in less than 3 minutes. While Tommy handled the plumbing, Belden, now fully committed, was attacking the electrical system. He had ripped out the M4's original dashboard and was rewiring the H-12's generator output directly into the massive capacitor bank that fed the acoustic amplifiers. He was a different man. No longer a defeated administrator, but the brilliant MIT engineer he had once been. He worked with a frenetic, precise energy, soldering thick-gauge copper wires, bypassing breakers, and shouting technical specifications at Tommy. "Valles, what's the generator's peak voltage at 400 RPM? 485, sir, but it's stable. No fluctuation over 0.5%. Tommy yelled back from inside the engine bay. "Good, good. The amps will kill the original wiring. I'm bypassing the main bus. We'll run the power straight from the generator to the tube bank. God help us if there's a short. It'll vaporize the entire vehicle." "It won't short," Tommy said, with more confidence than he felt. They worked through the night, a 2-man army fueled by black coffee and the sheer, terrifying audacity of what they were doing. The rest of the arsenal rumbled around them, but in the test bay, there was only the hiss of the welder, the click of wrenches, and the sharp snap of high-voltage wiring being seated. With 1 hour to go before Colonel Thorne's 8:00 a.m. deadline, they were done. The Mad G-01 looked like a joke. It was a Sherman tank that had, it seemed, been attacked by a locomotive and lost. The massive unpainted radiator was crudely bolted to its rear. Thick, ugly hoses snaked over the hull. The engine bay, with the cover plates removed, revealed Tommy's V-12, a complex alien heart in a body that wasn't its own. Belden and Tommy stood back, covered in grease, sweat, and soot. They were beyond exhausted. They hadn't slept in over 48 hours. "Well," Belden said, his voice raspy, "she's a monster." "She's my monster, sir," Tommy said, a strange sense of pride swelling in his chest. "All right, Valles, let's see if your monster has a heartbeat. Start it up." Tommy's hands trembled as he climbed onto the vehicle. He bypassed the normal driver's seat and stood over the engine bay, holding the bare leads for the starter. This was the moment. He had never tested the engine under this kind of load. He'd never run it for more than a few minutes in the warehouse. This was it. "Clear!" he yelled, his voice cracking. He touched the leads. There was a heavy thunk of a solenoid, then a low, grinding whir, and nothing. "Try it again!" Belden shouted. Tommy did it again. Thunk, whir, silence. "The batteries, sir. We've been using the batteries for the welders and the work lights. They're drained," Tommy said, panic rising in his throat. "Damn it!" Belden looked at his watch. 7:48 a.m. Thorne was probably crossing the Arsenal grounds right now. "Get the jump-start tug, now! Run!" Tommy scrambled, his bad leg making him stumble, and sprinted to the M5 Cletrac tug he'd used to drag the engine. He gunned its small electric motor and drove it alongside the prototype, dragging the heavy jumper cables. He clamped them onto the dead batteries, the metal sparking. "Give it a minute," Belden said, his eyes fixed on the entrance to the test bay. "Let them charge." Every second stretched into an eternity. The only sound was the high-pitched whine of the tug's generator and the distant, dismissive sound of the 8:00 a.m. factory whistle. "It's time," Belden said grimly. "Try it, Tommy." Tommy held his breath and touched the leads. Thunk, whir. And then a deep guttural chug. The engine caught, sputtered, and then, with a sudden smooth roar, it settled into a perfect low-throated hum. It was quiet. Unnervingly quiet. Unlike the ear-splitting, clattering radial engine it had replaced, the H12 hybrid engine purred. It was a deep, resonant, and incredibly stable sound. The massive external radiator fan kicked in with a whoosh of air, and the entire vehicle seemed to thrum with a new kind of life. "My God," Belden whispered, placing a hand on the hull. "It's smooth. The vibration is almost zero." "That's the 400 RPM sweet spot, sir," Tommy said, grinning, his teeth a white slash in his soot-covered face. "She'll do that all day. She'll do that for a week." "Don't celebrate yet," Belden said, pointing. "The main event." The sound of heavy, polished boots on concrete echoed from the bay entrance. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thorne appeared, flanked by 2 grim-faced MPs. His face was set in stone. He had come to bury his project, and he was not in a good mood. "Belden," Thorne said, his voice as cold as the morning air, "your 72 hours are up. I am here to sign the C4FA forms. Project Liar is terminated. I hope you have your, what in the name of God is that?" Thorne's eyes, and those of the MPs, widened in sheer disbelief. They stared at the monstrosity. They stared at the massive, spinning fan on the back, at the crude welds, at the mechanic standing on top of it, and at the chief engineer who looked like he'd just survived a train wreck. "That, Colonel," Belden said, stepping forward, his voice suddenly infused with a new, wild confidence, "is Mad G Era 1, fully operational." Thorne's lip curled. "Operational? Belden, it looks like you've been attacked by a junkyard. And what is that? Smell?" "Diesel, sir," Tommy piped up from the engine. "She's a diesel-electric hybrid." Thorne ignored Tommy, his eyes boring into Belden. "You were given a direct order to find a viable production engine. Instead, you have wasted the last 48 hours vandalizing a government prototype. You're finished, Belden. So is he. MPs, take them." "No!" Belden shouted. The word was so forceful, so unexpected, that the MPs actually paused. "Excuse me, Mr. Belden," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Belden walked over to the main control panel for the acoustic system, his hand hovering over the primary activation switch. "You came here for a demonstration, Colonel. You're going to get one." He looked up at Tommy. "Vallis, give me all the power you have. Engage the generator." "Yes, sir," Tommy yelled. He threw a heavy bus-bar-sized switch on the H-12's generator housing. Inside the test bay, the lights flickered for a second as the generator's massive magnetic field engaged. The engine's hum didn't change, but it took on a deeper, heavier tone. The load was on. Thorne, now intrigued despite his fury, crossed his arms. "Very well. You have 1 minute to impress me, and then I'm having you both arrested." Belden nodded. He looked at the audio controls. The test recording was already loaded. "Track 4, Armored Division, full advance." He turned the master gain dial, not to the test levels, but all the way to 100%. "Colonel," Belden said, a manic grin on his face, "I strongly suggest you cover your ears." He slammed his fist down on the play button. What happened next was not sound. It was a physical assault. The first half-second was a deafening crack of static as 3 tons of vacuum tubes and capacitors, flooded with more clean, raw power than they had ever been designed to handle, went from cold to white-hot. The massive loudspeaker horns, which had previously only managed to produce a pathetic, tinny squeal, exploded into life. The sound that erupted from the Mad EG was not a recording. It was a resurrection. It was the sound of 500 M4 Sherman tanks, 1,000,000 tons of steel, churning, grinding, and roaring across an open field. It was the high-pitched metallic squeal of 1,000 bogey wheels, the clank-clank-clank of tracks hitting drive sprockets, and the deep, earth-shattering thrum of 500 radial engines at full throttle. The sound was so powerful, so viscerally real, that it transcended hearing. It became a vibration that shook the concrete floor, that rattled the I-beams in the ceiling, and that hit the chests of the 4 men in the bay like a physical blow. Colonel Thorne, a man who had stood on a live firing range, instinctively flinched and clapped his hands over his ears, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. The 2 MPs went a step further. They unholstered their pistols, their eyes wide with panic, spinning around, convinced they were in the middle of a catastrophic tank collision inside the building. Loose bolts on a nearby workbench danced and rattled off the edge. A coffee mug on a desk vibrated to the edge and shattered on the floor. "Belden, shut it off! Shut it off!" Thorne roared. But his voice was completely inaudible. It was a goldfish mouth opening and closing in the face of a tsunami of sound. Tommy, still on the hull, clung to the welding seams, a wild, terrified grin plastered on his face. He watched the main ammeter connected to the H-12's generator. The needle, which they had feared would peg into the red, was sitting at 80%. It was steady. It wasn't just steady. It was rock solid, as immovable as a mountain. The diesel engine's hum was unchanged. The external radiator's fan was spinning, and the temperature gauge was well within the green. The H-12 wasn't straining. It wasn't overheating. It was working. It was, Tommy realized with a jolt of pure, triumphant joy. Happy. Belden let the recording play for a full 10 seconds, an eternity in that sonic hell. He saw the ammeter. He saw Thorne's face. He saw the H-12 performing flawlessly. With a dramatic flourish, he slammed the stop button. The silence that followed was more shocking than the noise. It was a heavy, painful vacuum, punctuated by a high-pitched ringing in everyone's ears. The 2 MPs were still crouching, guns out, breathing heavily. Colonel Thorne slowly, very slowly, lowered his hands from his ears. He was pale. He stared at the Mad G, at the massive, silent horns. He then turned his gaze, not to Belden, but straight up at Tommy Vallis, who was still perched on the engine. "You," Thorne said, his voice quiet but carrying in the dead air. "Get down from there." Tommy scrambled down, his bad leg almost giving way. He and Belden stood side by side, a bizarre pair of grease-stained, soot-covered vagabonds, facing a pristine, furious lieutenant colonel. The MPs, realizing the threat was over, reluctantly holstered their weapons. Thorne walked a slow circle around the prototype. He touched the hull, still vibrating with residual energy. He walked to the back and stared at the crude, massive locomotive radiator. He looked at the thick, exposed hoses. He looked at the ugly welds. "You had 72 hours, Thorne said, his voice flat. "I gave you a simple directive. Find a production engine. Instead, you. He seemed to be searching for the words. "You took a failed, scrapped, experimental thing from a defunct automobile company. You vandalized a multi-million-dollar M4 chassis with a cutting torch. You requisitioned, under false pretenses, a locomotive radiator and parts for a top-secret heavy tank. You bypassed every single procurement protocol, every safety regulation, and every direct order I have given for the last 6 months." He paused, stepping directly in front of Belden and Tommy, his face inches from theirs. "Gentlemen," he said, a strange new light dawning in his eyes, "it is the single most brilliant act of insubordination I have ever had the privilege to witness." Belden and Tommy stared, dumbfounded. Thorne turned to Belden. "You're a maniac, Frank. You just destroyed the hearing of 2 military policemen." He then turned to Tommy. "And you, Mr. Vallis, you are a certifiable lunatic." He stepped back and looked at the Mad G. It's perfect. Sir? Belden asked, daring to hope. It's perfect, Belden. Thorne was suddenly energized, his defeat gone, replaced by the frantic energy of a commander who just saw a path to victory. The sound. My God, the sound. It was horrifying. I thought the roof was coming in, and the engine. It held the load? He snapped, looking at Tommy. Yes, sir, Tommy said, finding his voice. 80% load, temperature stable, electrical output clean as a whistle. She can do that all week, sir, literally. As long as you keep feeding her diesel. All week, Thorne repeated, rubbing his chin. Not a tank engine, a mobile power station. You, Valis, you solved it. Thorne suddenly became all business. MPs, you will not speak of what you heard in this bay. Not to anyone. Ever. You are dismissed. The two men, still looking shell-shocked, nodded and quickly left. Belden, Thorne said, Project Liar is no longer terminated. It is now the single highest priority project in the U.S. Army. I am bumping Pershing production to get you what you need. I want 11 more of these. These monsters, assembled, tested, and on a boat to England in 30 days. 30 days, sir? Belden stammered. That's impossible. We don't have 11 more of these engines. Thorne looked at Tommy. Mr. Valis, the engine. Where did it come from? My company, sir. Valis Greece. We went bankrupt in 41. The assets were seized by the War Production Board. How many H-12s did you build? Just the one, sir, Tommy said, his heart sinking. The prototype. That's it. We never got to production. Thorne's face, which had been bright with victory, collapsed. One? You're telling me you just demonstrated a war-winning weapon and we only have one? The tooling, sir, Tommy said, his mind racing. The jigs, the dies, the schematics. They were seized, too. They should be in a government warehouse in Toledo. They were scheduled for scrap, but maybe, just maybe. Thorne was already moving. He strode to the secure phone and grabbed the receiver. He didn't dial. He spoke directly to the Arsenal operator. Get me General Vandenberg at the War Production Board. Yes, right now. I don't care what he's doing. Tell him Operation Fortitude is on the line. Yes, that Fortitude. Tell him I'm calling about a scrapped asset. Valis Grise. I need every piece of tooling, every blueprint, and I need it in Detroit by sundown. He slammed the phone down and turned back to his two engineers. Belden, you are no longer a project manager. You are a factory foreman. You have one job. Build a production line for these. Forget the rest of the arsenal. This bay is your entire world now. I'll get you the men. You build the tanks. Then he turned to Tommy. And you, Mr. Valis, your days of calibrating fuel pumps are over. You are no longer a mechanic. As of this moment, you are the chief civilian engineer for Project Liar. You are going to teach 100 men how to build your engine, and you are going to do it in a week. That tooling from Toledo. If it's there, you are the only man in the world who knows how to use it. Tommy Valis, the man who had been a bankrupt failure, a low-level grease monkey, just stood there, his mind reeling. He had gone from a court-martial to being the most important engineer in the entire arsenal in the span of 5 minutes. One more thing, Thorne said, his face deadly serious. This project, this engine, from this moment on, it does not exist. The official designation for this vehicle is M4 Sherman, Special Purpose Audio Engineering. The H-12 engine is Experimental Generator X4. You will not speak of diesel, electric, or hybrid. You will not speak of what it does. The men you train will be quartered here, in the arsenal. They will not go home. They will not write letters. The secrecy of this operation is paramount. The Germans cannot ever know that our Phantom Army is just a handful of lunatic mechanics and a scrapped engine. Do you understand me? Yes, sir, Belden and Tommy said in unison. Good, Thorne said, a grim smile returning. Now, Mr. Valis, I suggest you get some coffee. The trucks from Toledo should be here in 6 hours. You're about to build your masterpiece. Again. As Thorne strode out of the bay, his boots echoing with a new victorious purpose, Belden clapped a heavy, grease-covered hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Well, Mr. Chief Civilian Engineer," Belden said, the exhaustion and adrenaline warring in his voice. "We just tore up the rule book. Now we have to build an army." Tommy looked at his creation, the Mad G's 01. The monster, the joke, the anchor, the secret weapon. He walked over to it, running a hand over the steel hull, still warm from the engine's power. It was no longer a monument to his failure. It was the heart of the Allies' greatest deception, and he, Tommy Vallis, was the only man in the world who knew how to make it beat. The race wasn't over. It had just begun. The word impossible lost its meaning in the 30 days that followed. The Project Liar Bay was walled off, a curtain of heavy canvas and armed MPs separating it from the rest of the Chrysler arsenal. It became a fortress of frantic creation, a 24-hour symphony of screaming lathes and welding arcs. The tooling from the Toledo warehouse arrived on a convoy of flatbed trucks, just as Colonel Thorne had promised. It was a pathetic sight: rust-covered jigs, water-damaged blueprints, and heavy dies that hadn't seen oil in 3 years. To anyone else, it was a pile of junk. To Tommy Vallis, it was his past, his present, and his future. He stood on the loading dock as the last crate was unloaded, a sense of profound, terrifying responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was no longer just building an engine. He was resurrecting a ghost. Colonel Thorne was true to his word. He gave them men, the best machinists, the most skilled welders, and the sharpest electricians in the arsenal. But they were all in the dark. They knew they were on a high-priority project, but they had no idea what they were building. Tommy, now clean-shaven and wearing the new crisp white shirt of a civilian engineer, was their unwilling oracle. He couldn't just build the engines himself. He had to teach. He, a man who had spent years working in silence, now had to lead. He and Belden, who had transformed into a master of logistics, set up a production line that was less of an assembly line and more of a high-speed artisanal workshop. They worked in shifts, but Tommy never left. He slept on a cot near the new engine dyno, his ears tuned to the sound of his H-12s coming to life. The first one he built by hand, with the lead machinists watching his every move. He showed them the delicate balance of the V-12's crankshaft, the sweet spot for the fuel injection, and the almost alien wiring of the high-output generator. "It's not a car engine," he'd drill into them, his voice hoarse from shouting over the din. "It's a power plant. It has to be balanced. It has to be perfect. 1/8 of a millimeter misalignment in the generator shaft, and it will tear itself apart. Do it again." He was demanding, he was obsessive, and he was, for the first time in his life, utterly brilliant. The men, sensing the desperation and the genius, didn't question him. They just worked. As Tommy's team frantically built the hearts, Belden's team prepared the bodies. 11 M4 Sherman chassis were stripped, their turrets and guns removed and sent back to the main arsenal. The interiors were gutted, and the process of vandalism that Tommy had started was now industrialized. Cutting torches sliced through firewalls, welders fused the heavy-duty external radiator mounts, and electricians laid down miles of thick, shielded copper cable. Each vehicle was a unique, handcrafted monster. By day 20, the first 5 production models of the Mad G were ready. One by one, they were rolled into the soundproof test bay. One by one, a new engineer would power up the system. And one by one, the sound of 500 tanks would shake the building, a ritual that terrified the uninitiated and confirmed to Tommy that his engine, his scrapped engine, was consistent. It was reliable. On day 30, 12 M4 Sherman, special-purpose vehicles, their massive loudspeaker horns covered in canvas, their ugly locomotive radiators painted in olive drab, were loaded onto heavily guarded rail cars. Their destination was officially listed as Aberdeen Proving Ground. Their real destination was a blacked-out cargo ship in the port of New York, bound for Liverpool, England. Tommy and Belden stood on the loading dock, watching them go. They were too exhausted to feel triumphant, only a hollow sense of relief. "What now, sir?" Tommy asked, wiping his hands on a rag, a habit he couldn't break. "Now, Mr. Vallis," Belden said, lighting a cigarette, his first in a month. We go with them. The colonel insists. He wants the lunatic who built them to be there, just in case one of them gets a cold. 2 months later, Tommy Vallis, a man who had never been more than 50 miles from his Ohio home, stood in a muddy, rain-soaked field in Suffolk, England. This was Operation Fortitude. The Mad G vehicles were hidden in a grove of trees, part of a vast theatrical performance. They were surrounded by inflatable rubber tanks, wooden airplanes, and fake radio chatter designed to convince the German High Command that the main Allied invasion was coming at Pas de Calais, not Normandy. Tommy was in charge of the engine pool. His monsters, after the rough Atlantic crossing, were acting up. The British diesel fuel was different. The damp, cold air was playing hell with the electrical contacts. He and a small, hand-picked team of mechanics worked around the clock, tuning, tweaking, and waterproofing his H-12s. This wasn't a factory. This was the field. And the field was hell. On the night of June 5, 1944, Colonel Thorne arrived in a jeep, his face grim. He found Tommy with his arm buried in the engine bay of Mad G07. "Vallis," Thorne said, his voice low. "This is it. The real landings go in at Normandy in 6 hours. Tonight we turn on the Phantom Army. The Germans have their best panzer divisions waiting at Calais. We need them to stay at Calais. They'll be listening. They'll be watching. Your engines. They have to run tonight. No failures, no stalls, no excuses." Tommy just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. This was it. The purpose of the last 6 months, the culmination of his life's work, was all coming down to this one night, in this muddy field. "The operation begins at 0100, Thorne said. "All 12 units will activate simultaneously, moving in a 5-mile line, projecting the sound of an entire armored army preparing to embark." He put a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Good luck, Mr. Vallis. Make us proud." At ER-055, Tommy was in the lead vehicle, Mad G01, the original prototype. A young, terrified signalman sat at the controls of the acoustic system. "You just drive," Tommy told the driver. "I'll handle the engine." He stood over the H-12, his hand on the generator housing, as if he could will it to work through touch alone. The rain hammered on the steel hull. 0100, the signalman whispered, his hand on the play button. "Engage power, sir." "Engaging," Tommy yelled, throwing the heavy switch. The diesel-electric purr deepened. The ammeter needle snapped to ready. "Acoustics on." All up and down the 5-mile line, 12 men hit their switches at the same time. The night exploded, but this time it wasn't in a test bay. It was in the open air, across the rolling hills of Suffolk, aimed directly at the sea, at the German acoustic listening posts just across the channel. The sound was biblical. It was a metal avalanche, a roar of 1,000 engines, a clatter of 1,000,000 tons of steel. And it wasn't stationary. The 12 vehicles began to move slowly, their hybrid electric drives whining and perfect. Quiet counterpoint to the thunderous noise they were projecting. Tommy's engine, the heart of the beast, was flawless. The ammeter was steady. The temperature was green. The H-12 hummed its perfect 400 RPM tune, oblivious to the sonic Armageddon it was powering. For 3 solid hours, the Phantom Army maneuvered. They advanced to the embarkation ports. They idled in staging areas. They created an acoustic illusion so vast, so detailed, and so utterly convincing that it was inconceivable. At dawn, they went silent. The exhausted crews, their ears ringing despite the thick padding, emerged into the pale, misty light. Tommy sat on the hull of his prototype, his hands shaking, his body numb. He didn't know it yet. He wouldn't know it for weeks. But at that moment, German reconnaissance reports were flooding the desk of Field Marshal Rommel. "Major armored movement at Calais," they read. "Acoustic signatures confirm at least 2, possibly 3, full armored divisions preparing to embark. The invasion is here." Rommel, convinced by the sheer scale of the noise, kept his panzers at Calais. He held them there, waiting for a ghost army, for days while the real, fragile beachhead at Normandy was being established. The war was not won on that night, but it was saved. The critical window, the moment when the entire invasion hung by a thread, was protected by a phantom. And that phantom was powered by an engine that had been designated for scrap, a failed idea from a bankrupt company, resurrected by a quiet mechanic who refused to let his masterpiece die. History would remember the great tanks, the roaring planes, and the brave soldiers, but it would never know the name of the Vallis Grise H-12. It would never know the story of the quiet, diesel-electric hybrid that hummed in the shadows, powering the greatest lie in military history. And that, Tommy Vallis thought, as he watched the sun rise over the English countryside, was perfectly fine with him. He just patted the warm steel of the engine bay. He knew, and the engine knew.